What would you do if your boss called you a slave in front of everyone? For Brian Daniels, that moment wasn't the end, it was the spark that ignited a revolution in his workplace and beyond. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of a sleek, open-plan office in Austin, Texas. The faint hum of keyboards filled the air, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter from coworkers sharing fleeting moments of light-hearted conversation. It was an ordinary Monday for most, yet for Brian, it felt anything but. Every day had begun to feel like a battle he could never escape. At 34 years old, Brian Daniels was a black man with a penchant for crisp suits and a quiet determination that ran deep. He had been working at Bexley & Coombe for 5 long years. It wasn't just a job to him, it was an opportunity to shatter generational barriers. His family had always believed in the power of hard work, and Brian embodied that belief fully. But recently, he felt the weight of his efforts slipping away under the unspoken tension that simmered between him and his manager, Annette Sullivan. Annette was sharp, a no-nonsense leader who had ascended the corporate ladder at a rapid pace. To some, she was a symbol of perseverance, but to Brian, she had become a source of unrelenting, smoldering hostility. What began as small slights, a dismissive tone here, ignoring his ideas in meetings there, had gradually morphed into something more. Her sharp criticisms seemed to come louder and more often, each mistake of his magnified while hers went unnoticed. Over time, the tension grew harder to ignore. Every interaction felt like walking a tightrope, with one misstep threatening to send him crashing down. On this particular morning, Brian walked into the office with a mug of coffee in hand, mentally preparing himself for the day ahead. He had a big presentation coming up, one he had spent weeks meticulously perfecting. But as he reached his desk, something caught his eye. His presentation slides had been altered. His carefully crafted points had been stripped away, replaced with bullet points that barely scratched the surface of his work. At the bottom of the document, Annette's initials were stamped. Frustration surged within him, but he kept his composure. This wasn't the first time Annette had taken credit for his work, and he knew confronting her would only make things worse. Still, this time was different. He couldn't let it slide. Not today. "Good morning, Brian," Annette's voice sliced through the air, cold and sharp. She stood at his desk, arms crossed, lips curled into a smug smile. "I made a few changes to your slides. They were a bit too complicated." Brian looked up, meeting her gaze with a steady calm that felt more like a mask than anything else. "I see that," he replied, his tone neutral. "I would have appreciated a heads up before you made those changes." Her smile faltered for a brief moment before returning, sharper than before. "Well, that's why I'm the manager," she said, her voice dripping with a patronizing edge. "I know what works for our clients." It was a subtle jab, but it struck its mark. Brian clenched his jaw, but didn't respond. He knew better than to argue in front of everyone. But deep down, he knew that today something was going to break. The day dragged on as Brian prepared to deliver his presentation. His frustration simmered beneath the surface, but he focused on the task at hand. Over the years, he had learned to pick his battles carefully, knowing that every confrontation carried an invisible weight in the workplace. By the time the team gathered in the conference room, the air was thick with tension. Brian had rehearsed every line of his presentation, determined to make the best of the altered slides. As he sat up, Annette leaned casually against the door frame, cup of tea in hand, exuding an air of superiority. The room filled quickly with coworkers, some reviewing their notes, others scrolling through their phones. Annette clapped her hands sharply to gather everyone's attention. "Let's get started. Brian, the floor is yours," she said, her tone dismissive and clipped. Brian took a deep breath and began. Despite the changes, he delivered his points with clarity and confidence, weaving in the details Annette had stripped away. His coworkers nodded along, clearly impressed by his grasp of the subject. But Annette's icy glare told a different story. She interrupted him twice, questioning points he knew to be solid. The interruptions weren't about clarity, they were about trying to undermine him. Still, he pressed on, refusing to let her derail him. As he wrapped up, the room erupted in applause. One of his colleagues, Vanessa, spoke up. "Great job, Brian. That was really insightful." Annette's smile was thin, her eyes cold. "Yes, well," she said, "it seems Brian had some help with this. The team effort really shines through." The jab stung, but Brian's face remained neutral. As the meeting wound down and people filed out, Annette stopped him. "A word. In my office, she said curtly. Her office was as cold and unwelcoming as her demeanor. She gestured for him to sit, but Brian stayed standing, sensing this wouldn't be a casual conversation. Let's cut to the chase, Annette began, her voice as icy as the room itself. You've been walking a fine line lately, and I need to remind you who's in charge. The way you handled that presentation? Borderline insubordination. Brian blinked, stunned. Insubordination? For delivering a presentation effectively? Her eyes narrowed. For going beyond what was necessary. You made me look incompetent in front of the team. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and absurd. With all due respect, Annette, Brian replied, I simply wanted to present the full scope of my work. Her voice rose, sharp and cutting. Don't forget your place here, Brian. You're not the decision maker. You do the work you're assigned, and you leave the thinking to people like me. It was in that moment, as the words people like me hung in the air, that something inside Brian snapped. Excuse me, he asked, his voice calm but laced with disbelief. Annette didn't back down. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You know what I mean. You're here to follow orders, not to play hero. Or have you forgotten where you come from? The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Then, as if she had crossed an invisible line she couldn't see, Annette delivered the blow. You're nothing more than a glorified slave in this office. The words hit like a thunderclap. Brian's chest tightened, his fists balled at his sides. He didn't speak, yet. He needed a moment to process, to channel the storm of emotions brewing inside him. But silence wasn't an option. Brian knew he had to respond, and when he did, it would be a moment no one in that office would ever forget. Taking a deep breath, his mind raced. Annette's words echoed in his ears, the heat of anger rising within him. But he knew that giving into rage wouldn't be the answer. This moment wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for every person who had ever been belittled, disrespected, or dehumanized. He had to choose his words carefully. Stepping closer to her desk, Brian's voice rang out, steady, but with the weight of generations behind it. Annette, he began, his tone calm yet piercing, what you just said is not only offensive, it's unacceptable. And I won't stand here and let you degrade me or anyone else like that. Annette leaned back in her chair, a flicker of unease flashing across her face. You're being dramatic, she said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Brian shook his head. No, I'm being honest. Let me tell you something, Annette. My great-grandfather worked himself to the bone as a sharecropper in Mississippi. He picked cotton for wages that barely fed his family, yet he dreamed of something better for his children. My grandfather marched in Selma, fought for the right to vote, and never stopped believing in equality. My father spent his life telling me that no matter how much the world tries to tear you down, you keep pushing forward because your worth isn't defined by someone else's prejudice. The room fell into a heavy silence. The tension in the air was suffocating. Brian's voice grew stronger, more resolute. I didn't come here to be anyone's punching bag. Brian's words rang out, thick with emotion, as he stood before Annette, a force of quiet power. I've worked harder than you could ever imagine to get where I am today. No matter how much you try to belittle me, you can't take that away. The words hung in the air, sharp and unwavering. Annette's mouth opened, but before she could respond, Brian raised his hand to stop her. No, he said, his voice firm. Let me finish. You don't get to interrupt this time. You've had your say. Now, it's my turn. Turning toward the window, he gazed down at the busy street below, his eyes narrowing. Do you know how exhausting it is to walk into a place every single day, knowing you're judged not for your skills or work ethic, but by the color of your skin? To carry the weight of expectations, assumptions, and stereotypes with you everywhere you go? And still, I show up. I show up because I refuse to let people like you define my story. His words were now a fire, burning with a purpose. He turned back to her, his eyes fierce. I deserve respect, Annette. Not because of my title, not because of my credentials, but because I'm a human being. And so does everyone else in this office. He took a step closer to her desk, his voice dropping to a level that felt almost intimate, yet filled with command. What you said wasn't just wrong. It was a reflection of something deeper. Something this company needs to address. If this is the culture you're fostering, then it's time for a change. Just as he finished speaking, the door to Annette's office creaked open. A few co-workers stood there, their faces frozen in a mix of shock and admiration. They had overheard every word. Vanessa stepped forward, her voice shaky but resolute. "Brian, that was incredible," she said, her words full of emotion. "You're right. This has gone on for too long." One by one, others nodded in agreement, the silence in the office now thick with unspoken truths. But as much as the atmosphere had shifted, Brian knew this moment wasn't the end. The real battle had only just begun. As he stepped out of Annette's office, a wave of emotions swept over him. His co-workers' faces reflected everything from shock to admiration, some even guilt. What came next was unclear, but he felt no turning back now. Annette remained in her office, her expression caught between anger and disbelief. She had underestimated him, and now, for the first time, she seemed to realize the weight of her actions that could no longer be ignored. Brian's pulse raced as he walked back to his desk. His hands were still trembling slightly, the adrenaline still coursing through him. He had spoken his truth, but part of him wondered how the company would react. Would they dismiss it? Or would they finally confront the deep-seated issues that had been allowed to fester? Later that afternoon, an email from Human Resources appeared in everyone's inbox. The subject line was direct, immediate meeting, workplace conduct. Brian clicked on it, his stomach tightening as the words sank in. A meeting at 3 p.m. The room would be mandatory for all staff. When the time arrived, the conference room was packed. Annette sat stiffly at the head of the table, her usual aura of authority replaced with discomfort. Elena Chavez, the HR director, stood at the front, poised and serious. She wasted no time. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began. "As some of you may be aware, an incident occurred today that has brought serious concerns about our workplace culture to light. We're here to address that." Her gaze swept across the room before settling on Brian. "First, I want to thank Brian for his courage in speaking up. It takes incredible strength to confront injustice, especially in an environment where it's been allowed to persist." Annette shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. Elena continued, her voice steady and clear. "What happened today is unacceptable. Let me be clear, Bexley & Company has a zero-tolerance policy for any form of discrimination or harassment. An internal investigation is underway, and appropriate actions will be taken." The room grew heavy with the weight of her words, the silence profound. For the first time, Brian felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for everyone who had silently endured similar mistreatment. After the meeting, co-workers began approaching Brian. Their words were cautious, but sincere. Vanessa was the first to speak. "Brian, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have said something sooner. I saw how she treated you and I didn't do anything. That's on me." Kevin, another co-worker, stepped forward. "Man, I don't even know what to say. You stood up for all of us today, whether we realized it or not." Brian accepted their apologies with grace, but his response was clear. "This isn't just about me," he said. "It's about ensuring that no one else has to go through this. If we want change, it has to come from all of us." The following days were a blur. Annette was placed on administrative leave, and whispers began to circulate around the office. More stories surfaced, stories of others who had been mistreated, overlooked, or belittled by her, but had been too afraid to speak out. But Brian wasn't interested in relishing the fallout. His focus remained on the bigger picture, ensuring that this moment marked the beginning of real change. The atmosphere at Bexley & Company gradually began to shift. Conversations that had once been avoided were now being held openly. The HR department launched a comprehensive initiative to tackle workplace bias, bringing in outside consultants to lead workshops and facilitate discussions on diversity and inclusion. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Brian found himself in an unexpected role, one of leadership. His co-workers sought him out for advice, and his presence at company meetings commanded newfound respect. He wasn't just a man who stood up to Annette. He had become a symbol of resilience, someone who had turned a moment of adversity into a catalyst for change. When the investigation into Annette's actions concluded, her termination was announced. The company issued a formal apology and reaffirmed its commitment to fostering a respectful work environment. For Brian, the news was bittersweet. He didn't celebrate her firing. Instead, he focused on what mattered most, the bigger picture. One afternoon, Elena approached Brian with an idea. "We'd like to start a diversity council," she said. "And we think you'd be the perfect person to lead it. You've shown incredible strength, and we want to make sure voices like yours are at the forefront of this company's future." Brian hesitated. The weight of the responsibility settled in his chest. But as he looked around the office, the faces of his co-workers, some hopeful, others still unsure, he realized there was no turning back. "I'd be honored," he said. "But this has to be about all of us, not just me. Everyone here needs to feel like they have a voice." The council's first meeting was a turning point. Employees shared their stories, some painful, others inspiring. They discussed how to improve hiring practices, ensure equal opportunities for advancement, and create a culture where everyone felt valued. Brian listened carefully, taking notes and making sure every voice was heard. Outside of work, the incident sparked conversations within the broader community. Brian was invited to speak at local events, sharing his story and encouraging others to stand up against injustice wherever they found it. His message was simple: change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we have the courage to speak out, even when it's hard. As time passed, Bexley & Company became a case study for how a company could confront its shortcomings and grow. It wasn't easy, mistakes were made along the way. But the commitment to doing better remained steadfast. For Brian, the journey was far from over. But as he walked into the office one morning, greeted by smiles and nods from his co-workers, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had taken a stand, and it had mattered. And so, to anyone watching this story unfold, remember this: your voice is your power. Speak up, even when it's uncomfortable. Challenge prejudice wherever you find it. Because real change starts with courage. And courage starts with you.